The air in the town square is not cold, though it is a winter morning. It is thick heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, roasted meat from street vendors, and the underlying sharp tang of wood smoke that hasn't yet been lit. In the center of the cobblestone stands a vertical beam of oak blackened by previous fires, a grim totem around which the entire community has gathered. They are not here to mourn. They are here to watch a human being be reduced to ash. The crackling flames, the suffocating smoke, and the sight of someone tied helplessly to a stake, the punishment of burning alive, was more than just a death sentence. It was a message of terror, a public spectacle meant to sear itself into the memories of all who witnessed it. Imagine standing in a crowd, the heat on your face as the fire roars, while a victim's cries of agony pierce the air. This was no ordinary execution. It was a calculated performance of fear, cruelty, and power. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. In this video, we will uncover the most infamous cases of burning at the stake, where every detail from the selection of the wood to the timing of the fire was designed to prolong suffering and strike fear into the hearts of those who dared to oppose authority. Burning was the ultimate theatrical production of the medieval world, a morality play where the special effects were real agony and the final curtain was total annihilation. We will walk through the forensic reality of what happens to the human body when it is consumed by heat, stripping away the sanitized myths to reveal the blistering truth. We will stand in the marketplace of Rouen with Joan of Arc and feel the dampness of the wood chosen to torture her. We will witness the botched executions where the fire refused to climb, leaving victims baking in a low-heat oven rather than burning. Stay with us. What you are about to hear will reveal the darkest depths of medieval justice and humanity's capacity for horror. We often think of the Middle Ages as a time of chaos, but the stake was an instrument of order, a way to surgically remove the cancer of heresy from the body politic. But, as we will see, fire is a chaotic weapon, and when it is unleashed, it does not always obey the executioner's command. The boundary between divine justice and sadistic butchery dissolved the moment the torch touched the kindling, transforming the public square into a literal antechamber of hell. Burning at the stake, a punishment that evokes visceral horror, was more than just a method of execution. It was a ritual designed to instill fear and enforce societal norms. The journey to the stake began long before the fire was lit. Victims, often accused of heresy, witchcraft, or other grave sins, were typically subjected to a degrading procession to the execution site. This was the auto de fe, in the Spanish tradition, the act of faith, where the condemned were paraded through the streets, stripped of their dignity and clothed in simple garments to mark their shame, often a yellow sackcloth painted with flames and demons, known as the San Benito. They were paraded through jeering crowds. The auditory landscape of this procession was a cacophony of condemnation, the ringing of church bells, the chanting of friars, and the curses of neighbors who had often provided the testimony that sealed the victim's fate. The hands of the condemned were frequently bound with wet ropes or wire, and in some cases they were gagged with iron devices to prevent last-minute declarations of innocence or curses against the church. The authorities feared the voice of the heretic almost as much as their deeds. A final charismatic speech from the flames could turn a criminal into a martyr. At the stake itself, meticulous preparations were made. Wooden stakes were erected in the center of a prearranged pyre, typically surrounded by bundles of kindling faggots of brushwood and straw for quick ignition. The height of the stake mattered. Sometimes it was elevated on a platform to ensure that even those at the back of the crushing mob could witness the moment of death. Historical records, such as those by Jean Froissart, describe how chains or iron collars were used to secure the victim to the post. This ensured they would not escape as the fire consumed them, holding them upright even after their muscles had been cooked into uselessness. The executioner would often smear the victim's garment with pitch or sulfur, not to grant them a quicker death, but to ensure they ignited with a flash of color and violence that would dazzle the spectators. Why was fire chosen? Fire carried deep symbolic significance in both religious and cultural contexts, making it the preferred method of execution for perceived sins against God or society. It was not merely about killing the body, it was about obliterating the soul's vessel. Theologians believed fire had a purifying quality as referenced in the Bible, for our God is a consuming fire, Hebrews 12:29. By burning the condemned, their physical bodies were destroyed in a way that symbolized the eradication of their sins, a literal cauterization of the wound they had inflicted on the spiritual community. Furthermore, ecclesiastical law forbade the church from shedding blood, so handing a heretic over to the secular arm to be burned allowed them to kill without technically breaking their own rules against spilling blood. Practically, fire was also an accessible and visually dramatic means of execution. It ensured a slow, agonizing death, maximizing its deterrent effect. Unlike beheading, which was over in moments and reserved for the nobility, or hanging, which was for common criminals, burning was a special category of horror reserved for those who had betrayed the fundamental order of the universe. Burning prolonged the suffering, forcing spectators to confront the consequences of defiance or moral transgression. The sight of flesh blackening, the smell of roasting meat that would drift over the town for hours, the transformation of a human being into a charred statue, this was the theater of the state. Moreover, fire left little to bury, denying the victim a proper burial, a fate that carried spiritual ramifications in medieval society. Without a body to rise at the Last Judgment, the heretic was doubly damned, erased from the earth, and potentially erased from eternity. The time it took for a victim to die during a burning at the stake varied based on several factors, including the type of wood, the presence of accelerants, and the placement of the flames. We must look at this with the cold eye of a forensic pathologist. Typically, victims succumbed within 15 to 30 minutes if the fire was hot and well constructed. However, succumb does not mean they died instantly. It means they lost consciousness. In cases where wet wood was used or the flames were kept low, the process could stretch for hours. Historical records describe the agonizing process in detail. Victims often inhaled thick smoke, leading to carbon monoxide poisoning. This would cause confusion, lethargy, and eventually asphyxiation before the flames caused fatal burns. But this mercy of suffocation was not guaranteed. If the wind blew the smoke away, or if the fire was too low, the victim would remain conscious as their lower extremities began to cook. In some instances, executioners attempted to hasten death by placing gunpowder pouches around the neck or beneath the arms, which would explode when exposed to heat, killing the victim instantly or at least destroying the vital organs. But even this was a gamble. For example, the English Protestant martyrs Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, burned in 1555, suffered prolonged deaths due to poorly constructed fires. The gunpowder bags tied to Ridley failed to ignite properly, or perhaps the fire was too low to reach them quickly. Onlookers recorded his agonized cries in vivid detail as his legs burned away completely before the fire even touched his upper body. The physics of heat mean that the human body does not just burn. The fat renders the muscles contract into the pugilistic pose, resembling a boxer protecting their face, and the fluids boil, creating a spectacle of biological destruction that no witness could ever unsee. Among the most notable cases was the execution of Joan of Arc in 1431. The French heroine was accused of heresy and sorcery by the English after claiming divine visions and leading French forces to critical victories in the 100 Years' War. After a highly biased trial, Joan was tied to a stake in Rouen marketplace. The English were terrified of her. They needed to prove she was a witch, not a saint, and to do that, they needed to destroy her completely. They built the scaffold exceptionally high so that the executioner could not reach her to strangle her, a common mercy performed covertly to spare the victim the pain of the flames. Joan would have no such mercy. She was to face the fire fully conscious, elevated above the crowd like a pagan idol being toppled. Wet wood was deliberately used to create a slow-burning fire, prolonging her agony. This was not an accident. It was a strategic choice to ensure the crowd saw her suffer and die, removing any doubt that she might have escaped by magic. Witnesses reported her cries of Jesus echoing above the flames, leaving many in the crowd in tears. The fire consumed her slowly, stripping away the clothes, then the skin, revealing her feminine form to the mob to prove she was indeed a woman, before the flames finally claimed her life. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine River to prevent her becoming a martyr, to ensure no relic remained that could inspire a new rebellion. The English wanted to erase her, but in their cruelty, they etched her name into history with fire. Another infamous case is that of Jan Hus, Zec reformer burned in 1415. Hus was condemned for challenging the Catholic Church's authority, criticizing practices such as indulgences. He was promised safe conduct to the Council of Constance, a promise that was cynically broken the moment he arrived. At his execution, green wood was piled around him to produce thick smoke, suffocating him before the flames consumed his body. But before the smoke took him, the heat began its work. Green wood does not burn cleanly. It smolders, it hisses, and it produces a cloying, acrid smoke that burns the eyes and throat long before the fire touches the skin. Hughes reportedly sang hymns as he was burned, his voice rising from the billows of white smoke, a haunting melody that turned his execution into a terrifying liturgy of defiance. Huss's final defiance inspired his followers to revolt, leading to the Hussite Wars. His death proved that you can burn a man, but you cannot burn an idea. In fact, the fire often acts as an accelerant for the very cause it seeks to destroy. But not all burnings were of high-profile political dissidents. The W. Arsberg and Bamberg witch trials of the early 17th century were deeply rooted in medieval attitudes and represent the industrialization of the stake. Hundreds of victims, many of them women, were tortured into confessing witchcraft before being burned alive. In these mass executions, the stake became a conveyor belt of death. Whole families were wiped out. The Prince Bishop of Bamberg built a special witch house, complete with torture chambers and ovens, turning the eradication of witches into a bureaucratic enterprise. Fires were often constructed to burn slowly, prolonging their suffering, while the screams of victims served as a grim reminder of the consequences of dissent. The executioners in these trials were paid per head, incentivized to find more victims and to make the execution spectacular enough to justify the expense. Richard Weisch, a priest executed for heresy in 1440 on Tower Hill, met a horrifying fate for spreading Lollard teachings inspired by John Wycliffe. Tied to a stake, he faced a fiery death as a crowd watched. The flames consumed him slowly, an agonizing end meant to terrify dissenters. The ground where he died was later treated as a pilgrimage site by his secret followers, who gathered the ashes mixed with soil as holy relics, defying the very intent of the execution. His unyielding faith and refusal to recant, even as the fire rose, turned his death into a symbol of defiance against church corruption, inspiring future reformers. Each of these cases underscores the terrifying nature of burning at the stake, an act not only of punishment, but also of psychological warfare, ensuring the horror lingered in the minds of all who witnessed it. But we must also consider the executioner's perspective. For them, a good burning was an art form. If the wind was wrong, the victim might die of smoke too fast, cheating the crowd. If the wood was too dry, the fire might flash over and kill them instantly. It required a macabre expertise to balance the fuel and the airflow to achieve the maximum duration of pain. The executioner walked a fine line between serving the law and serving the mob, often needing to prod the fire with iron hooks to ensure the consumption was total, treating the human body like a log in a hearth. Burnings at the stake were deliberately public events intended to instill fear and demonstrate the authority of rulers and the church. Crowds often gathered in the thousands, treating executions as both a solemn moral lesson and a form of macabre entertainment. In London's Smithfield or Madrid's Plaza Mayor grandstands were erected for the nobility. Vendors sold food and trinkets, turning these events into carnivals of cruelty. People would travel from neighboring villages, bringing their children to watch. It was a social event, a break from the drudgery of daily life, where the community reinforced its boundaries by watching the destruction of the other. The smell of the burning fat would settle into the clothes of the spectators, a souvenir of the day. They watched a soul be evicted from its body. Reactions, however, varied. Some onlookers expressed horror, particularly when the condemned showed signs of innocence or piety. Accounts of Joan of Arc's execution mention witnesses weeping openly as she prayed aloud. Even the English soldiers who had fought to kill her were shaken by her demeanor in the flames. Others, hardened by years of such spectacles, viewed the condemned with indifference or even scorn. They would jeer, throw rotten vegetables, or cheer when the gunpowder bags finally exploded. This desensitization is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the history. How many burnings does one have to see before the sight of a person on fire becomes mundane, before the screams become just background noise to a day out at the market, despite the intended purpose of deterring dissent? Public executions occasionally backfired. The death of Jan Hus, for instance, galvanized his followers, sparking the Hussite Wars. Similarly, the brutality of witch trials in places like Salem, Massachusetts, or the mass burnings in Germany eventually led to widespread criticism. When the cruelty becomes too extreme, it ceases to look like justice and starts to look like tyranny. The spectacle of the stake began to erode the moral authority of the institutions that used it. As the Enlightenment approached, the idea of torture as a tool of truth and fire as a tool of justice began to fade, replaced by more clinical, though no less lethal, methods of control. The ashes of the martyrs became the seeds of skepticism, as the stench of burning flesh made it increasingly difficult to believe that this was truly the will of a loving God. Burning at the stake was not just a method of execution, it was a deliberate act of cruelty designed to strip victims of dignity while showcasing the power of those in control. It was the ultimate assertion of the state's power over the individual, the power to unmake you. From Joan of Arc's suffocating cries in the flames to the prolonged suffering of Nicholas Ridley, these cases show how this punishment was engineered to be as terrifying as possible. The psychological impact on the victim before the fire was even lit cannot be overstated. Waiting in the dungeon, hearing the sounds of the pyre being built, the procession through the hostile crowd, it was a dismantling of the self before the dismantling of the body. Beyond the physical agony, the psychological torment inflicted on both the victims and the witnesses ensured that the fear of dissent burned as brightly as the flames. It forced everyone to be complicit. By watching, by doing nothing, the crowd validated the execution. They became participants in the ritual. This shared guilt, this collective trauma, was the glue that held medieval society together. To speak out was to risk taking the place of the victim on the pyre. Silence was survival. And so the fires burned for centuries, fueled by wood pitch and the silence of good people. What horrifies you the most, was it the slow, deliberate suffering, the inescapable fate of the accused, or the fact that these events were public spectacles meant to entertain and terrify? Was it the theological justification, the idea that burning a person alive was an act of love to save their soul? Or is it the realization that human beings are capable of inventing such elaborate ways to destroy one another? The stake stands as a monument to our darkest impulses. A reminder that civilization is a thin veneer over a deep well of savagery. It challenges us to look at our own modern forms of public shaming and punishment and ask if we have truly evolved, or if we have simply traded the physical flames for digital ones. The era of burning at the stake eventually came to an end, not with a sudden realization of its immorality, but with a slow shift in legal and cultural norms. The last person executed for heresy in Britain was Thomas Aikenhead, hanged not burned in 1697. In Spain, the Inquisition held its last auto de fe in the 19th century. But the scars remain on the collective psyche of the West. The phrases we use, the images of which hunts the visceral fear of fire, these are the echoes of the stake. The places where these burnings happened, Smithfield in London, the Old Market in Rouen, are now busy streets or quiet memorials. You can walk over the ground where Nicholas Ridley's legs burned away and not even know it. But we must remember the smell of the smoke and the sound of the prayers. We must remember that these were not characters in a storybook, but real men and women who died in unimaginable pain because they dared to believe differently, or look different, or simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. History is not just dates and kings, it is the record of human suffering and human resilience. By uncovering these stories, we pay witness to those who were silenced by the flames. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more insights into history's darkest moments with medieval spirits. Together, we will continue to uncover the brutal truths of the past. We dig up the bones of history to find the truth buried beneath the lies. Because as long as we remember the flickering light of the pyres, we can hope to keep the darkness at bay in our own time.